Today is May 5th, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine is evolving very rapidly now, following months of grinding attrition by Russian forces on Ukrainian defenses along the line of contact, but also deep behind the line of contact. Infrastructure, military facilities, storage warehouses, air defense systems, grinding down every aspect of Ukraine's military capabilities, depleting the equipment, the ammunition that has been sent to them by the collective West. This is now finally culminating in the crumbling of Ukrainian lines, at least in the Donbass region. So before I get going with all of the articles from across the Western media tracking this, and we'll look at it and try to interpret it, let's look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map. So even this pro-Ukrainian map admits that the situation is dire along the line of contact. So let's take a look. Again, red is Russian-held territory. We come down here and we can see that there is fighting all along the line of contact, but most of the progress that Russia is making now is in the Donbass region and in several areas outside of Donetsk city. This is Russia continuing to build on its gains, seizing Avdiivka, and now moving very, very far beyond even where they were last week. So last week, I showed the difference between last week and the week before that. So this is this week. This is last week, this week, and last week. So you can see how Russian forces are now constantly gaining ground, and they're not doing this because they're specifically trying to take ground. They are continuing to put pressure on Ukrainian forces, and they just happen to be moving forward to the point where it just has by default become a forward moving offensive. Let's go back to the map and look elsewhere. That's outside Donetsk. If we go up outside of Bakhmut, we've been hearing a lot about Chasiv Yar, right here, this area, right beyond Bakhmut, and then beyond Chasiv Yar is Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Russian forces are, even according to this pro-Ukrainian map, they are in and around the inside of Chasiv Yar, this area, this built-up urban area, and it's just inevitable. Russian forces will take Chasiv Yar as well. And the fighting continues along the line of contact. And of course, Russia continues its long-range drone and missile strikes all across Ukraine, targets all across Ukraine. Let's start looking into the headlines. So the first headline we should consider is from the BBC. This was 6 days ago. But I think it's still relevant. Situation on frontline has worsened, Ukraine army chief says. So the head of Ukraine's army is admitting that the situation is dire. This is not just Russia saying this and one random pro-Ukrainian map saying this. This is from top to bottom. Everyone now is on the same page. Ukrainian forces, their defenses along the line of contact are crumbling. The article says, Ukraine's commander-in-chief has said the situation on the front line has worsened in the face of multiple Russian attacks. Alexander Syrsky said Ukrainian forces had withdrawn from positions in the eastern Donetsk region. Russia is trying to take advantage of its superiority in manpower and artillery before Ukrainian forces get much-needed supplies of new U.S. weapons. Now, these additional supplies, weapons, equipment, vehicles, I went through the list in the last update, and you can see that it is nothing significant. It is nothing that is going to make any difference at all. It is not even going to slow down this crumbling of Ukrainian lines. It's simply not enough to do that. And this has been the problem even before the delay. This was all building up. If we remember months ago, Western analysts, the Western media, Western government representatives were all saying that Ukraine was in a stalemate. But what was actually happening was an inflection point. And there was an inflection point where the pressure was so intense and Ukrainian forces becoming so depleted that they were no longer able to make any sort of significant counterattack, and they were no longer able to even hold vital places along the line of contact. They began losing even heavily fortified cities like Avdiivka. So now this process continues. Ukrainian forces are going to continue to deteriorate. All of their problems are going to compound as that happens. Sending the same insufficient amount of arms, ammunition, and other supplies is not going to change that or even delay it. This collapse was long in the making. This was the whole point of Russia's strategy of attrition. When we see statements like that in the Western media, this is basically the light at the end of the tunnel method that the West has been using to compel Ukraine, to compel the general public to continue supporting this proxy war in Ukraine and to continue encouraging Ukraine to fight on. But in reality, Ukraine is not going through a tunnel. There is no light at the end of it. They are digging a hole straight down. So whatever light that they're seeing, it is not a light at the end of the tunnel. It's probably just their headlamp as they keep digging deeper and deeper, reflecting off of the rocks around them as they go to the center of the earth. Here's another one. This is from The Guardian. Russia makes more gains around Avdiivka as Ukraine awaits US aid. So again, it's the same narrative from each one of these media platforms. Russia has consolidated recent battlefield gains in the east of Ukraine and is attempting to break through Ukrainian defensive lines before a long-awaited package of U.S. military assistance arrives at the front line. According to the Institute of the Study of War, the Kremlin is seeking to exploit a window of opportunity before U.S. assistance is delivered. Moscow has been bringing in reinforcements and has a threefold advantage in some sectors. But again, if you've been listening even to the Western media, they have admitted that there is a growing numerical advantage for Russia, whether it's manpower, artillery pieces and armor, the rate of fire of Russian weapons, all of it. Russia has an advantage, threefold, even tenfold sometimes. The fact that they continuously go back to the Institute for the Study of War, no matter how wrong they have consistently been throughout this entire conflict, the fact that they continuously go back to them is astounding. The article also says the officials suggest the next few months will be critical. Ukrainian service personnel complain that they are completely outgunned. Russia is able to fire at least 6 shells for every salvo sent by Ukraine in return. Stocks of Soviet-era anti-aircraft missiles ran out long ago. We've talked about that in depth many times. With Russian warplanes able to operate freely close to the front line, it actually doesn't even matter whether they have air defense missiles or not. Russia is using glide bombs, which are dropped out of range of the remaining air defense systems Ukraine has. Whether they had missiles or not, doesn't matter. Ukraine has fewer tanks and armored vehicles. So we always hear about Russia losing hundreds of tanks every single day, and they're going to be out of tanks by next month, or the next summer they'll be out of this fall they'll be out of tanks. But it's actually Ukraine. We can see on the battlefield, we can see that Ukraine is out of everything, including armor. In recent months, Moscow has repeatedly targeted Ukrainian infrastructure. A missile attack on Saturday hammered power facilities in central and western Ukraine. DTEK, the country's largest private electricity company, said 4 of its 6 thermal power plants were damaged. And when you see the images of these damaged power plants, it is significant, probably for all intents and purposes, irreversible damage. But again, I've gone through this aid package line by line, and people who have followed my analysis over the last 2 years will remember me going through all of these aid packages as they're announced and posted on the Department of Defense's website. And we can see how this type of package has been sent to Ukraine for months and months, a year or more actually. And even as it was being sent before the delay, Ukraine's situation was becoming critical. And then of course it will get worse during the delay, but as I pointed out, whether the US was sending equipment all along or there was this big gap in sending the equipment, it really doesn't make any difference, because there is just simply not enough arms and ammunition to send Ukraine. The West's collective military-industrial base does not make enough arms and ammunition to supply Ukraine to sufficiently fulfill its needs on the battlefield. They cannot match, let alone exceed, Russian military production and the subsequent rates of fire on the battlefield. There are other problems that Ukraine has that even these articles are mentioning. Manpower, for example, a lack of military aviation. There was absolutely nothing in these aid packages announced not by the United States or Germany or the UK or any of the other countries sending equipment and other forms of support to Ukraine. There was nothing mentioned that is going to change the manpower crisis. What could change the manpower crisis? Ukraine, its military forces have been decimated. Entire brigades have been decimated. They need to be reconstituted, but they can't, because if they leave the battlefield for rest and recuperation, the front line will just collapse even further. The crisis will accelerate even faster. Also in the Guardian article is a map which also shows the gains. These are recent gains, and you can see the darker red, those are the gains that have been made. So this isn't the Russian Ministry of Defense saying this. This is the Western media, even Ukraine itself, admitting that the crisis is accelerating. Here is the deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence. Ukraine is on the brink, says senior general. That article has been covered by Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikuris on the Duran. I highly suggest you follow their daily updates on the conflict in Ukraine. Then the Guardian article talks about Ukrainian plans to target the Crimean Bridge. So the article says, intelligence officials indicate they intend to blow up the road and rail bridge connecting the occupied peninsula with Russia. And we have heard this over the last 2 years. This is all we've heard. Ukraine has attempted at least 2 times to actually destroy the bridge. They've carried out attacks on the bridge and caused damage, temporarily closing parts of the bridge. As I have pointed out, the bridge was constructed years after Crimea rejoined Russia. And before it was constructed, there was no land bridge. The only way to supply Russia's military stationed in Crimea and the civilian economy was through seaports and airports. And there are many major ports in Crimea and airports that can move millions of tons of cargo back and forth and millions of people as passengers, including ferries that move passengers and their cars, their vehicles. If the bridge was destroyed, Crimea would not be isolated. It was not isolated before the bridge was constructed. The land bridge is still very much intact. The 2023 Ukrainian offensive was supposed to cut it. It came nowhere close to doing so. So the idea of blowing up this bridge for some sort of strategic objective is, at face value, it is absurd. What it is another PR stunt, a substitute for a lack of ability to actually achieve anything of strategic significance. We have this article from Newsweek talking about this. Crimea rocked by explosions as bridge shut. And they were talking about these longer range ATACMS targeting Crimea. We haven't heard anything about any sort of significant damage caused by these longer range missiles, as predicted. Newsweek says traffic on the main bridge linking the Russian mainland with annexed Crimea was temporarily halted as Moscow said Ukraine attacked the peninsula with U.S.-supplied missiles, Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS missiles. The Kerch Bridge serves as a key supply route for Russia's forces. Ukraine struck the 19-kilometer, nearly 12-mile road and rail bridge in October 2022 and again in July 2023. The bridge is crucial to sustaining Moscow's military offensives in southern Ukraine. Kiev has vowed future strikes on the structure as it seeks to recapture the peninsula, which Russia annexed in 2014. So all of that about it being an essential logistical route for Russian forces is untrue. It is completely false. The vast majority of troops along the front line are supplied by land routes, not via Crimea. And even the military supplies going to and from Crimea are most likely going through airports and seaports. Even in the Western media, there are admissions that Russia is no longer sending any sort of military equipment across the Crimean Bridge. And Ukraine is desperately, obsessively trying to destroy this bridge because it would be such, in their mind, a public relations coup. In reality, it's going to simply further galvanize the Russian people against the Ukrainian and US NATO-backed Ukrainian threat. And if it does boost morale in Ukraine, all it's going to do is feed the population into this war faster, which is not going to change Ukraine's fate. It's just going to seal it quicker. The fact that Ukraine is obsessed with a counterproductive objective, a public relations stunt, tells you a lot about where Ukraine is strategically and its US NATO sponsors. I've been talking about the ATACMS. It's been back in the news. They have sent the longer range ATACMS. This is the next wonder weapon that pro-Ukrainian commentators believe is going to turn the conflict around somehow. And I mentioned how other long-range precision guided weapons transferred by the US to Ukraine have been rendered ineffective, essentially. The HIMARS guided rockets, 70-kilometer range, GPS jamming, and missile defense systems are shooting them down. Electronic warfare is jamming their GPS signal, so they're just missing their targets if they're not intercepted altogether. The longer range, you remember this. You don't hear about this anymore. This was a wonder weapon of the week. The ground-launched small-diameter bomb. So this is Defense One. Another U.S. precision-guided weapon falls prey to Russian electronic warfare USS. And there's others besides the guided rockets of HIMARS, and this article is actually going to get into them. A U.S. defense official would not provide specifics, but is likely referring to Boeing's ground-launched small-diameter bomb. U.S. provided precision-guided munitions that failed in mission after mission in Ukraine, taken down by Russian electronic warfare. The Pentagon revealed the latest casualty, a new ground-launched version of an air-to-ground weapon delivered for Ukraine on a rapid timeline, failed to hit its targets in part because of Russian electromagnetic warfare. Bill LaPlante, the Pentagon's acquisition chief, said at an event held by think tank CSIS. LaPlante suggested that Ukraine may no longer be interested in the weapon. When you send something to people in the fight of their lives that just doesn't work, they'll try it 3 times and they'll just throw it aside, said LaPlante. The weapon LaPlante is referring to is very likely the ground-launched small-diameter bomb. Based on his description, according to Brian Clark, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. A Boeing spokesperson did not confirm that LaPlante was referring to the GLSDB, but said the company is working closely with the Defense Department on spiral capability improvements to the ground-launched SDB system. Spiral capability improvements refers to an iterative software development process. They think they can change the software and somehow overcome the electronic warfare. The problem is all Russia has to do is change their software and then they're right back to square one, missing targets. And again, this is already played out with HIMARS, the 70-kilometer range guided rocket. This is this longer range ground launch small diameter bomb. Essentially, it's a glide bomb that the HIMARS will fire with a rocket to get it to altitude, and then it will glide down to its target. It's not the first GPS-guided weapon to fall afoul of Russian electronic warfare. In congressional testimony in March, Huston Institute senior fellow Daniel Patt said the targeting system for the GPS-guided Excalibur round, remember that, the Excalibur rounds, this 155 millimeter artillery round, GPS-guided, it was supposed to be worth 100 Russian conventional rounds because it will hit the target exactly on the first shot. Turns out that's not the case. Its effectiveness dropped from 70% to 6%. 70 to 6. The number 6%. Over a matter of a few months as new electronic warfare mechanisms came out in Ukraine. Pat cited the work of Jack Watling, an expert at think tank RUSI, who has traveled to Ukraine multiple times to interview Ukrainian commanders. Russian electronic warfare attacks have also directed GMLRS missiles off course. The GMLRS, these are the guided rockets fired by HIMARS. And that was CNN, and I've cited that article many, many times in previous updates. The missiles are similarly guided by a GPS. Russia has also successfully used electronic warfare against GPS-guided joint direct attack munitions. So these are actual glide bombs, JDAMs, dropped by whatever's left of Ukraine's Air Force. Those have been jammed. Those are missing their targets, which are retrofitted aerial bombs. Russian electronic warfare on the U.S.'s most precise capabilities is a challenge, the commander of the chief U.S. aid coordinating group told an audience in December. Now, when we talk about these weapons being neutralized, we don't mean that 100% of them will not get through. But as you can see with the Excalibur round, it went from 70% to 6%. If it's 6%, it costs many times more than a conventional round. You have far fewer of them, and it only has a 6% chance of hitting its target. It makes it essentially useless. It's not worth the time and effort to include it if that is its effectiveness. The article concludes by saying Ukraine could use other U.S. munitions that are not susceptible to GPS spoofing, Clark added, citing the Harpoon missile. The U.S. could also provide more sophisticated munitions like the JSOM, Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, but Clark discounted that possibility because of its range. The Biden administration has sought to limit Ukraine's use of longer-range weapons that could target Russia directly. Well, we know the U.S. doesn't care if Ukraine is targeting Russia because they're helping Ukraine target Russia. The problem is these longer-range weapons are being stockpiled for the war the United States is trying to provoke with China in the Asia-Pacific region. JSOM specifically is one of the key capabilities the U.S. currently does not have enough on hand for the war it's trying to start with China. They're desperately trying to ramp up production. The last thing they want to do is start sending them to Ukraine, where not only are they going to disappear and never come back, Russia will find a way to counteract the missile, and then it will share the information with China, which will only compound all of these multiplying problems the U.S. already has with its military-industrial base and the weapons and ammunition that it produces. The article also talks about F-16s being better suited for dropping these JDAMs, these U.S. glide bombs, because the aircraft itself can guide the bomb down to its target, but Ukraine already had an air force. It has been wiped out with only a few planes remaining. They're taking off from highways. They're hiding in caves. The F-16 is not going to fare any better. There's nothing special about the F-16 that's going to help it evade all of the ways Russia used to eliminate Ukraine's original air force. The F-16 will be susceptible to air-to-air weapons that Russia's much larger air force has, and more capable air-to-air capabilities the Russian Air Force has. Their pilots will be better trained and better capable, more effective in their aircraft than Ukrainians trained on the F-16, which takes years, and they have not been training for years. They've been training for months. Russia also has some of the best air defense systems on Earth, the most numerous air defense systems on Earth. So they have been shooting down Ukrainian aircraft and drones, and they will shoot down F-16s if they get anywhere near the line of contact, anywhere near within range. And then, of course, Russia has long-range weapons that have been attacking and destroying Ukrainian aircraft on the ground before they even take off. When they're left out in the open, and if Russia detects them, they destroy them. And this same process will take place with the F-16 unless they're piloted by NATO personnel and they're being based outside of Ukraine. That's the only way that will not happen, and that's only if Russia restrains itself and does not decide to attack the F-16s as they're based beyond Ukraine's borders, which is a strong possibility. Russia will have plenty of opportunities to destroy the F-16s as they're operating in Ukraine's airspace. Now let's talk about the manpower issue, because many recent articles have been mentioning that, along with the arms and ammunition shortage. They're talking about this US aid that's supposed to fix the arms and ammunition shortage, which in reality it will not. But they don't talk about how to address the manpower shortage. But I did see one article, and this was covered by Alex Christoforou in one of his recent videos. This is from Foreign Affairs. American aid alone won't save Ukraine. To survive, Kiev must build new brigades and force Moscow to negotiate. This was May 2nd, 2024. This wasn't last year. This wasn't before the 2023 Ukrainian offensive. This was May 2nd, 2024. This was just a couple of days ago. And they're back to talking about building new brigades. Why? And we'll get back to this article in just a moment. I want to show you this other article. This was actually covered by Alexander Mikuris, also of the Duran. Forbes, the war-weary 47th Mechanized is Ukraine's emergency brigade. The Pentagon is rushing replacement vehicles to keep the exhausted unit in the fight. The 47th Mechanized Brigade has been fighting nonstop for nearly a year. So now you see why they want to build new brigades, to give these established brigades a break, because they're being run into the ground. This is what Forbes says. When Ukrainian forces collapsed outside a village a few miles west of the ruins of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine a little over a week ago, the Ukrainian army did what it usually does in the case of a crisis. It deployed the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the army's emergency brigade, to borrow the Ukrainian conflict intelligence team's term. The all-volunteer 47th Mechanized Brigade is trained by NATO instructors and rides in American-made M1 tanks, M2 fighting vehicles, the Bradley, and M109 howitzers. These are 155mm self-propelled howitzers on tracks. The 47th Mechanized Brigade couldn't stop the Russian 30th Motor Rifle Brigade from capturing the town last week, deepening a 5-mile salient that's like a knife lodged in Ukrainian territory. But the brigade did what Ukrainian commanders asked. It addressed the emergency and prevented the Russians from significantly widening the salient to the south. But again, the point is actually not to widen salients, take territory and widen salients. The whole point is to force Ukraine to fight when their units are exhausted and grind them down into oblivion, which is exactly what Forbes is describing is happening to the 47th. And that it talks about that. But the cost to the 47th Mechanized Brigade's roughly 2,000 troopers has been enormous. A brigade is usually 4,000 strong, so 2,000 is quite small for a brigade. The brigade is badly in need of rest, reset, and reorganization. So again, the whole point was to force the 47th Mechanized Brigade to continue fighting despite not being able to wear it down, prevent it from resting, refitting, reorganizing, forcing it to fight on. And the longer it fights on, the less effective it is, and the easier it is for Russian forces to further deplete it. It is a cycle. It's a self-defeating cycle. That is why they're doing that. It's not to create this salient. It just so happens they've captured this territory because Ukrainian lines are in the process of collapsing, incrementally collapsing. The article goes on and explains what this strategy of attrition is doing to even Ukraine's best units. It says the Ukrainian defense minister has replaced the brigade's commander 3 times since September. That is not a good sign. The 47th Mechanized Brigade struggles to find a commander worth keeping, explained militaryland.net, an analysis group that tracks Ukrainian military developments. Now led by its 4th commander in 7 months, who was formerly of the well-regarded 56th Motorized Brigade, the 47th Mechanized Brigade is practically begging for a break. It has suffered hundreds of casualties, I would say maybe even thousands if it's down to 2,000 troops. A constant change in command is a very bad sign. Once enough officers and NCOs have been maimed or killed, no longer fit for service, you're going to run into these problems. You're not going to have anyone appropriate to fill these positions. You're going to promote people who are not ready to try to command these units. They're not going to be able to. And then military command, the Ukrainian government, is going to blame them for that and remove them and just put someone else equally incapable of leading the brigade into their place. And the same thing is going to happen. And of course, all while the brigade is being mismanaged and misled, the brigade is being dismembered. It has lost at least 40 of its roughly 200 M2 fighting vehicles. Again, they're talking about the Bradley, and 5 of its 31 M1 tanks. Those are the Abrams, and I think that's actually 6 now. Another one was just destroyed. Fearful of losing more of the 69-ton M1s to Russian drones, the brigade recently pulled the surviving tanks off the front line so unit leaders could rethink their tactics. Rethinking tactics. The problem Ukraine has is that a modern main battle tank is meant to fight as part of a combined arms force, and Ukraine does not have the components of a combined armed force. So it's just sending tanks out in the open without proper support, no air cover, not enough artillery support, no air defenses, and then the tanks are just vulnerable and they're going to be picked off and destroyed. It's as simple as that. And there is no tactic to rethink. What you need to do is build a combined armed force, and the equipment and the manpower and the ammunition to do that simply does not exist, will not exist anytime in the foreseeable future. Another factor that is not being mentioned here is the fact that these tanks, these infantry fighting vehicles, the armored personnel carriers, they were just dumped into Ukraine. They were just sent to Ukraine. They were given very rudimentary training. As I pointed out before, the first Bradley or Abrams or Patriot or any of these systems were sent to Ukraine, I pointed out the fact that it takes years to integrate even a single new weapon system into an armed force. You have a new tank that you're going to adopt and use. It can take years to figure out how it's going to fit in, train every level of your army to either use it or cooperate with it so that it operates effectively on the battleground. Now, of course, you can send these tanks, as the US and the rest of Europe have done, to Ukraine. You can teach them how to drive it, how to point the gun and fire, but they will not be effective on the battlefield, and then they will get picked off. And again, you cannot change tactics to solve this problem. You just need the proper amount of time to properly, effectively integrate the weapon system into your armed forces, which Ukraine cannot do at this point. The article concludes by saying a new commander could solve the 47th Mechanized Brigade's leadership problem. New tactics could preserve its remaining tanks. An influx of M2 Bradleys could replenish its assault battalions. Well, not if you don't address the reason you've lost all those Bradleys in the first place, which of course they're not. But what the brigade really needs is a break from combat. There have been reports of the tactical grouping of troops Donetsk bringing in fresh units to stiffen its new defensive line around the salient. If true, that could mean the 47th Mechanized Brigade might finally get a rest. Well, I wouldn't count on it, at least for a little while, maybe just until the next emergency. So let's go back to this article here. American aid alone won't save Ukraine. They're talking about building up new brigades, because that's what Forbes is saying. Build up and send new brigades so the 47th Mechanized Brigade can get a rest. Well, let's go through this article and let's figure out why, again, that is illogical, unrealistic, and is not going to work. The article admits, just as I have been pointing out, that this 61 billion, which again, it's not actually 61 billion in weapons, it's a fraction of that is going to weapons Ukraine is actually going to get, is not going to change the course of the fighting. I think that is obvious to everyone, and even the Western media is admitting this. It also talks about the devastating impact of Russian military aviation. These glide bombs, their glide bombs are effective and numerous and being utilized all across the line of contact. And it's forcing Ukrainian troops to abandon their defenses because the glide bombs are much heavier, more powerful than artillery shells. When they hit your defensive positions, your defensive positions have been compromised. You're not going to be able to withstand it for long. And your only choice is to just stay there and be decimated or withdraw, which Ukraine has been doing a little bit of both. The article then claims the solution for Ukraine is to go on small and numerous counterattacks in active defense, in other words, to disrupt Russian advances. But it never addresses the fact that Russia has all of these advantages in long-range weapons, artillery, a definite advantage in artillery. The glide bombs that I just mentioned a few paragraphs before, how are you going on these small counter offensives, conducting this active defense and dealing with the glide bombs or the artillery shells? It never accounts for that. And then it says Ukrainian commanders must form new brigades rather than simply bringing their existing formations back up to strength, which they can't even do, by the way. The army currently lacks enough brigades to rotate them as a whole off the front line. Instead, individual brigades have been rotating exhausted battalions just off the line of contact for brief respites, a strategy that provides rest but does not allow for collective training of the brigade, since brigade staff and enabling equipment remain at the front. Thus, it is crucial for Ukraine to build and train additional brigades now so that it can mount an active defense in the fall. Over time, these new units will greatly enhance its ability to counterattack. Again, a brigade is 4,000 men strong. It is not just a brigade. A brigade is the overall unit. Within the brigade, you have multiple sub-units. You have battalions, companies, platoons, and then even smaller units than that. And at every level, you need to have NCOs and officers in various leadership roles. It requires a wide variety of technical expertise. You need artillery, armor, air defense. A brigade usually includes a wide variety of capabilities requiring a wide range of properly trained, effectively trained soldiers. You cannot do that between now and fall. As a matter of fact, if we remember, from 2014 to 2022, the United States, along with the rest of NATO, was building up multiple brigades over the course of 8 years. Those brigades have been completely eradicated. Those soldiers, that trained manpower, the entry-level soldiers, the NCOs, the officers, they're gone. They're either maimed and never stepping back on the battlefield again, or they're dead. So if that force built up over the course of 8 years was incapable of achieving these objectives that Ukraine still insists in pursuing, and remember, with all of the equipment and ammunition that NATO was providing Ukraine from 2022 up until now, what are they going to achieve by throwing together brigades between now and this fall, considering the very much smaller amounts of arms and ammunition being sent? I actually did a whole video on building up new brigades. It was based on a paper written by a U.S. military officer. They were talking about the possibility of the U.S. getting in a large conflict with a peer or near peer competitor, losing entire brigades worth of men and equipment, and the necessity of building new brigades. And they talked about how between difficult and impossible it is to build entire brigades over such a short period of time. Their solution for filling NCO and officer leadership positions was drawing them from other parts within the army, but for Ukraine, that is not an option. So really, the only option for giving Ukraine's decimated brigades any sort of rest or any sort of opportunity to refit, retrain, is if NATO troops come in and take their place. That is really the only possibility. Ukraine itself is not able to do this. They weren't able to do it ahead of the 2023 offensive because they tried. They were trying to throw brigades together over the course of less than a year, and it demonstrably failed. And now they're trying to do it again under much worse conditions, I might add. And all at the same time, Ukraine's military crumbles, Russia's military continues to get stronger. And again, I've covered articles where the Western media admits Russian military is 15% bigger now than it was when the special military operation began. So maybe we should talk about Russian arms production. We have this article from Al Jazeera. Russia ramps up weapons production for Ukraine war. Defense minister says Russia needs to boost volume, speed of production as U.S. sends military aid to Ukraine. Now, actually, in this article, there aren't many details, but myself, other analysts following this closely, we have been talking about Russia expanding military-industrial production. I recently talked about Russia not only refurbishing T-80 tanks, modernizing T-80 tanks, bringing them up to modern standards with modern optics, fire control, guns, engines, but they're also talking about building entirely new T-80s along with entirely new T-90M main battle tanks. Instead of just having one production line of brand new main battle tanks along with refurbished and modernized tanks, you're going to have two variants. The T-90M is a diesel engine main battle tank. The T-80 BVM has a turbine engine. It is faster, has a shorter range, but it is in terms of mobility, but it is much faster, and it's often said much quieter on the battlefield than its diesel engine counterparts. The speed at which Russia is doing all of this is incredibly fast. So they're already building new turbine engines. They said they were going to put together new engines last year. Now they're starting to put together brand new turbine engines for their T-80s. And eventually their production line will be able to produce new T-80s. And to reinforce this premise that Russian military-industrial production continues to expand and that it's outproducing the collective West, we have this from Foreign Policy. Alex Christopher also went over this article in a recent video, how Kiev plans to use American aid. This is Dmitry Kuleba. He's the foreign minister of Ukraine. And in this interview, he says, in 2 years of war, Russia has become more efficient in producing weapons than the whole Western alliance. It's a bad sign. And a point that Alex Christopher made in his video was that what the Ukrainian foreign minister is trying to do is shame the West into sending more weapons, more ammunition. But again, as we have exhaustively discussed, it simply does not exist to send to Ukraine. Panic is setting in, and I would like to just point out that when panic starts to set in, especially amongst policymakers, decision makers, desperation starts to set in, and panic and desperation can become extremely dangerous. We already see the French government repeatedly talking about sending troops into Ukraine, and then they admit that it's a policy of strategic ambiguity, which is essentially almost admitting that it's a bluff. If French forces were sent into Ukraine, they're still going to have the exact same problems in terms of artillery shortage, air defense shortage, shortages of armor, because the amount of tanks, armored vehicles that they have is one thing. We can see that if it's not supported by a sufficient amount of artillery, they're going to be destroyed very rapidly, and the West is incapable of building replacements fast enough. This is the problem that Ukraine has. This is the exact same problem NATO forces going into Ukraine will have. They will have advantages that Ukraine right now does not have. They will have military aviation assets that have not been spent at all whatsoever. They will be coming in fresh, but air power alone is not enough to win a war. You might have some initial success against Russian forces using the combined power of NATO military aviation, but as soon as Russia adapts and overcomes this and begins dealing with it you're going to be back down to who has more artillery, who has more armor, who has more and better trained infantry, who are better equipped and better supplied. And it really does look like Russia is coming ahead in all of those categories. I fear that this whole process, and not just in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East, also here in the Asia-Pacific region where I'm based, this is going to simply have to run its course. The multipolar world, nations like Russia, China, Iran, and a growing number of other nations pivoting away from this Western-led unipolar world order to multipolarism. What they're trying to do is manage this attempt by the West to reassert itself, all of these wars that it is starting in an attempt to do so. They're trying to manage it and minimize the death and destruction these conflicts are causing, the disruption it's causing to the rest of the globe, until it has fully run its course and hopefully more sensible interests come into power in, say, Washington, on Wall Street, in London, in Brussels, and then the world can move forward in a constructive manner. I will continue keeping an eye on this conflict, as well as the conflict in the Middle East, also growing tensions here in Asia Pacific. Later this week, I have a video coming out about the situation in Myanmar. This is a conflict often overshadowed by what is taking place in Ukraine, in the Middle East, elsewhere here in the Asia Pacific region, but it is nonetheless a part of this wider global conflict that is taking shape as the Western unipolar world rails against the emergence and rise of multipolarism. So until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do and it helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Check the video description for all of the links to everything that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, a donation month to month, or even if you have no funds to spare at all and you're just helping share my work with others, getting the word out there, all of that is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.